Health and Medical Care Liability Board, and we had around 4,500 claims against doctor each year, and in about 400 cases the doctors got a reprimand. But from January this year the system is a little bit different, and now we have changed the focus from ordinary, when we do investigations, from ordinary doctors and nurses to the healthcare provider, the hospitals. Before 2011, the authorities almost only investigated doctors and very seldom healthcare providers. The doctors, as I said, they got a warning in around 10% of the cases, but then nothing much more happened. And to prevent something from this happening again. And the healthcare provider, he said it was the doctor's fault, so why should we change our routines? But from this year, with the Patient Safety Act in Sweden, the focus is more on the healthcare provider, the hospital, than the doctor, and we are more interested in systems and processes, what has gone wrong. So it's now up to the healthcare provider to work more systematically with patient safety, to work with prevention of injuries, investigation of adverse events, inform patients when an adverse event has happened, and the healthcare provider have to have a plan what to do to prevent injuries in the future. And to increase patient safety by more incident reports, disciplinary actions like warnings to doctors has been taken away. And this is so we can have a blame-free reporting. And instead of warnings, if the doctor is not doing a good job, he can be put under surveillance for 3 years. And you have to have a plan for that period. And if the doctor doesn't follow that, then they can take his license. But the important thing is that we are more now in Sweden investigating systems and not doctors. In Sweden, it is the insurance companies, they take care of the investigation when it comes to patient insurance. And we think that is a better procedure with an administrative procedure than going to court, because we have lower cost per case for claims handling, short time for claims handling, and there is no economic risk for patients anymore. In Sweden, if a patient makes a claim to an insurance company, the claims handling at the insurance company at an average costs around $1,100 US. And if he's not satisfied with the decision of the insurance company, he can go to a claims panel, a national claims panel, and that's where I'm working. And the cost for an average claim there is $1,200 US. But they still have, if they want to, but it's very rare, they can go to court. But then if a patient loses, he has, as I said before, to pay at least $27,000 US just for lawyers' cost, and then we also have the cost of the court. So that is much, much more expensive. The time for settle a case in Sweden, when we went to court before, it took many years. Now the patient will have a decision in 50% of the cases within 6 months. 80% of the cases will be done within 12 months. And just the day before I left for Taiwan, I heard that the first figure here, 50%, is now almost 70%. So it's much faster now, which is important for the patient. It's only the Nordic countries that have patient insurance, and one of the reasons is it's always a problem. Who is to pay for the insurance? And that I understand can be a big problem here in Taiwan. In Sweden, therefore, you have to remember that the compensation for patient insurance is subsidiary to the general welfare system. And we have in all the Nordic countries, we have a well-built-out welfare system. So that means if you have a patient insurance, a working insurance, car accident, whatever, the welfare state always compensates up to 80% of the loss of income during acute illness. And if the patient is disabled, cannot go back to work, the welfare system in Sweden always pays around 64% of the salary the patient had before. And the patient insurance just have to come in and go all the way up to 100%. So we don't have to pay everything when it comes to loss of income and costs. But in a country like United States, for example, the insurance company has they have to pay from the first dollar. And costs, I could also say, for healthcare in Sweden, it's not free, but it's very cheap. A patient that sees a doctor and buys drugs and so on, during 1 year, he should never pay more than $350 US. Everything over that is paid by the state. And if a patient goes to hospital, even if he has heart surgery or whatever, he only pays around $15 a day. In Sweden, the main rule is that compensation can be paid out if the injury was avoidable, and that is of course a technical term and can be rather tricky. We had a lot of problems, not problems, but it took some time for us, 3-4 years, to decide what injuries could have been avoided and what could not have been avoided. But now we have pretty good guidelines and case law here, and we have a big consensus in the organization what to compensate and not. Unfortunately, I don't have the time here to go into details, but you can go in on the internet and see, because we have there articles in English of what compensation could be paid and not. But the definition of an avoidable injury is that compensation is paid if the injury caused by medical treatment, provided that the injury could have been avoided either by a different performance of the chosen procedure or by choosing some other available procedure, which according to an assessment made retroactively from a medical point of view would have satisfied the need for treatment in a less risky way. So you could say that the avoidability standards is principally defined as injury that would not occur in the hands of the best practitioner or system. So if you have a hip operation or another operation where you have surgery and you have a nerve injury, you could always ask, perhaps the nerve was in an area where it usually is not, and had the surgeon known about that, he could have, of course, avoided the injury. So the assessment to whether the injury could have been avoided under the circumstances that existed is done after the fact. So afterwards, you always have more information than when you give treatment. But we make the assessment with all the facts that we have afterwards. And the standard of care used in this assessment is that of an experienced specialist in the field concerned. So I was talking about hip operation. If it's a hip operation, then it's the standard of the chief surgeon at the clinic. So sometimes perhaps you have an operation, you have a young doctor, and there are many complications, and there is an injury. And you cannot blame the doctor, but still you could say if it had been a very experienced doctor, it would have been possible for him to avoid the injury. And then we say that the rarity and severity of the injury is not considered. The crucial question is whether the injury could have been avoided or not. And here it's a little difference to the Danish system, and Dr. Hove, he will say something about that later on. If you have an accident in Sweden, what kind of compensation do we pay? Well, first we have economic losses. And as I said before, we have a very good welfare system in the Nordic countries. So first they compensate a lot, whatever the reason. And then if you have a patient injury, from our scheme then we compensate up to 100% for loss of income and additional expenses. And in Sweden, so it's always up to 100%. And then you could also have compensation for non-economic losses like pain and suffering, permanent disability, and so on. And here you get everything from $1, and in severe cases you can get all the way up to $250,000 US for non-economic losses for pain and suffering. And if the patient dies, compensation can be paid for funeral expenses, loss of support. If the breadwinner in the family dies, then loss of support can go to the rest of the family. And special contribution to next of kin, that's kind of a compensation for pain and suffering, for losing someone very close. And in Sweden then, the patient, they have to make the claim to an insurance company, and if they are not satisfied with that, they can go to a national board, the patient claims panel, to look into the case. And in very, very rare cases, you could still go to court. In Sweden, we have, as I said before, around 9 million inhabitants, and we have 12,000 claims. 6,000 of those claims are accepted. The main reason for not accepting a claim is that there is no causal relation between the healthcare activity and the injury. Basically, it's part of the patient's basic injury that they are reporting. And in 1,100 cases, the patients are not satisfied with the decision of the insurance company, and then they can go to the claims panel, and we make another decision in about 10% of the cases. And then still, in the very end, you have the right to go to court, but as you see, perhaps 10 cases a year, 1 or 2 cases accepted. But that means out of 12,000 cases in Sweden, around just 1 can go to court and win. So we have almost, so that is very seldom. You may wonder where do the patient injuries happen? And of course they happen where you have the most surgery. Here you have, you see orthopedic surgery is 21% of the claims, 23% of the cost. General surgery, 15% of the claims, 13% of the cost. And then we come to an interesting group here. It's obstetrics and gynecology. It's 8% of the claims, but 25% of the cost. And why could that be? And I will very soon come back to that. And then you can also see dental clinics, they have 11% of the claims, but teeth injuries are mostly not very expensive, so it's just 2% of the costs. Well, why was, when we were looking at obstetrics, it was only 8% of the claims, but 25% of the cost. And the reason for that is that here we have the most expensive personal injuries that you could have, and that is brain damaged children. We have in Sweden, there are about 100,000 infants born every year in Sweden, and around 30 claims per year for financial compensation are filed due to birth-related injuries. And around 12 cases of avoidable brain injuries are compensated every year. And they are very expensive. As you could see here, that the compensation for these 12 avoidable brain injuries is around 20% of the total compensation from the patient insurance. And as I said before, we have around 6,000 cases compensated. And the causes for these brain injuries were that CTG interpretation was wrong. The personnel had not been acting timely on abnormal CTG, and then oxytocin prescription had been done, in a wrongful way. And then you have non-optimal mode for delivery, and that the rules for resuscitations had not been followed. What are the weaknesses with the Swedish system? I think that you could say that we have had this scheme now for 36 years in Sweden. The patients are very satisfied with the scheme, the doctors are very satisfied, our politicians are satisfied, and the media is not writing anything about it. But of course, things could always be better. And the first here, the avoidability criteria is difficult to understand. We think it is actually the best criteria for compensation, but it takes a while to get the knack of what is avoidable and not. Harvard University, they have a big problem, as you know, in the United States. So they are visiting us about every third or fourth year and try to make new drafts and changes for the United States. And they thought that the avoidability criteria was difficult, but then once they got into it, they thought it actually was the best one. That if you have that criteria, it will take a while in the start at least. And then we have the question of informed consent is not covered by the Patient Injury Act. In these cases, they think it's better with the old system where you had to go to court, because when it comes to informed consent, you have to hear the doctor and the patient, and that could better be done in the court than through an administrative system. What are the advantages? Well, it's much easier now to get compensation than before. More patients are compensated. Compensation is paid on objective grounds. The rule of evidence is more liberal than in tort law. A procedure fee of charge, it's free, so it's no risk for the patient, shorter time for claims handling, low administration cost, and no blame for doctors. That also means no fear for reporting, and claims can therefore be used for learning. And it's also easier to do root cause analysis and find failure of routines and system rather than individual failure. And as I said before, we have a better relation between patients and doctors. And I will end to show you some figures that very clearly shows the difference between the Nordic system and the rest of the world. If all countries had the same population, 10 million inhabitants, Sweden, as I said, actually just have 9, and Spain 43 million. But if they had the same population, Sweden and Denmark would have 3,000 cases compensated each year, and that is for inpatients in hospitals. And then you can see a country like the Netherlands that is very close to Sweden in many ways, but it's just 500 cases, and Spain 100. Sweden and Denmark, we have no blame systems. The rest have the old, what we call tort law systems, where you have to show negligence. And you could look at the figure then for Sweden and Canada. We have 3,000 claims compensated. Canada has 175. But the costs for the schemes are actually almost the same. In Sweden, every Swede, these are costs for claims per inhabitant and year. And in Sweden, every Swede pays around 10 US dollar per year for the compensation. Canada 9. But we compensate 3,000 cases. Canada just 175. And what could the reason for that be? Well, of course, there are many reasons, but these are the main. This is my last picture, and this is the main reason that in the United States and in Canada, around 70% of the premiums of the cost for the insurance goes to the lawyers and administration, and only 30% to patients. So in these countries, if you pay out $1, it costs $2, and that's not very efficient. In Sweden, the administration costs a little less than 20%, and the compensation to patients, that's 80% of the money in the system. And we think that's better paid money. Okay, thank you very much.
My name is Lars Hove. I'd like to start saying thank you very much for the invitation, and I'll be especially grateful for Dr. Ye. He showed so much passion and energy. We are so impressed, and we had a wonderful time. I'm going to give you a presentation of the patient safety in Denmark, and I hope you may be inspired and maybe use some of it. To beginning, I'll say Denmark is a quite small country. We have only 5 million inhabitants. You've got 23 million, so my numbers has to be multiplied by at least 5 to be compared to Taiwan. Well, I like to start a little dramatical with a case. Maybe the worst case we've had in Denmark. This took place about 10 to 15 years ago, actually in the same hospital where I work now. And the case, it was a 28-year-old pregnant woman. She went into hospital in labor. Everything seemed fine. There was no signs of hypoxia in the beginning. The admission CTE was normal. Suddenly there was severe signs of hypoxia, and it was decided to make an emergency cesarean. So the woman was brought to the operating theater, and At the operating theater, a resident in anesthesia was in charge of the anesthesia. She was giving a general anesthesia and everything seemed fine. They were just going to say start to the surgery, but then the ventilator had alarm for rising pressure and the woman decelerated. That means her oxygen level in the blood fell. So they extubated her because they thought it was wrong placed and intubated her again and put her back on the ventilator. The same thing happened. The ventilator gave alarm about rising pressure and the woman decelerated. The attendant in anesthesiology was called and he came to the operating room very fast and he extubated the woman, intubated her again and put her back on the ventilator. At that time, the condition of the woman was very poor and she actually went into cardiac arrest. They tried to resuscitate her, but without success. So she died, and actually the baby died, and a couple of months later, her husband committed suicide. So we actually have one event causing 3 deaths. And what was the reason for this to happen? Well, they did an autopsy of the woman, and the autopsy showed that she had bilateral pneumothorax. And why did she develop that? One thing I had to say is that the resident in anesthesia, it was one of her first days on call. In our system, residents, they change hospital every 6 months, so she just came from another hospital and she was not familiar with the equipment in the operating room. Different hospitals have different equipments. So when she came to the operating room, when she came to the operating room, one tube was disconnected, and it was a tube where you see the arrow. It was disconnected, and she was not familiar with this ventilator, so she took the tube, and this is the tube for exhaling when the patient has to expire, and she put that tube down to the iron piece you see below, and that meant that it was actually not possible to exhale because there was an iron piece that was totally massive. She put that tube from the top to the bottom, and that was actually the reason that the patient got air inside her lungs. She couldn't let the air pass. And this was many years ago, so what did they do? They actually, not much, they thought it was an individual fault, and other hospitals, they have the same system and it could have happened other places too. A couple of years later, we analyzed all anesthesia claims and we found that there was certainly a problem here. So we made it some difficulties in making the same error once more by putting another connections to the iron piece so that the tube does not connect anymore, and furthermore we made the tubes shorter so they can't reach the iron piece. The resident actually dropped being a physician and was given a warning. But why does these errors occur? Well, we know that we are working in a complex and it's a partly unpredictable system. Rules and routines are not always sufficient, and the organization is not always appropriate. You might say that a ventilator must not be made so that different tubes can be placed wrong places, and that is the organization, that is not always the individual's problem. But we have also that education of healthcare personnel is not always sufficient. And finally, we are not robots, to err is human. We have some obvious catastrophes where a lot of people die at once, and they draw great attention. And on the other hand, we have our hospital system where death is more sneaky and hidden, but in total probably a lot more is dying from injuries at the hospitals. Nowadays, it's you don't use the word error. You have to use adverse events in Europe when talking about patient safety. And what is an adverse event? In short term, it just when something not goes as planned. But the definition is more like it's something that happened or nearly happened in connection with treatment or care for the patient, and it has no relation to the patient's actual disease. And it caused injury, or it could have caused injury to the patient. And then we have a serious adverse event. And a serious adverse event is an adverse event that causes 7 days of extra hospitalization in average. And how often, how frequent is the problem about an adverse event? There have been several studies, and all of them found about 9 to 11%. AE stands for adverse events, serious adverse events actually, and PRE stands for prevention. So about 35 to about 50 of these could have been prevented. So we actually can do something about this. What's the cost of adverse events? It's not cheap. In Denmark we have 1.2 million admission a year, and if we use the studies from before, 10% serious adverse events with an average of 7 days extra hospitalization, that gives 120,000 multiplied 7 multiplied 700, the cost of 1 day's hospitalization, that is $588 million. And maybe the most important, there's a lot of human cost in this, and there are other costs when people are disabled and for their future income. I might say that a serious adverse event, it could be infection after an operation. That's also it's not always an avoidable complication. How do we register these accidents? We have actually 3 ways when a patient is injured, how he can react. One, the patient, he can go and register the adverse events himself. The healthcare person can make an anonymous registration of the adverse event. That's one possibility. He can seek, the patient, if he's injured, he can seek for compensation by the Patient Insurance Association. And finally, we have kept the old system where you can complain to make a disciplinary act to the healthcare person. And actually the patient may feel in all claims for all 3 systems. All 3 systems are independent of each other. To talk about the adverse events, it's very easy to make a report of an adverse event, and patients and the doctor or another healthcare person can make the report. You just go to a website and fill in the report. In 2004, we had in Denmark the first law of health in the world, and saying that a person who becomes aware of an adverse event in connection with the patient's treatment or care, he must fill in a report of this incident. And it's very important that he cannot be punished for filling in a report. The report cannot be used in any legal perspective at all. There's no punishment if he forgets to fill a report. It's a law without punishment, you may say. And how many reports has we received in Denmark in 2004 when it started. There was 4,000 cases. People should be aware of the new law, so the number increased. So in 2010 we have 35,000 cases, and now in 2011 until November we have 70,000, and we think it would end about 80,000 reports of adverse events. So it's really a lot of reports. And when you fill in a report, you write in short terms what happened, where did it happen, and what was the consequence. And the patient or the doctor also write how could it have been prevented, in their opinion. And what happens to a report in the system? Well, there are patient safety coordinators local at the department where the incident took place. They look at the report. The direction of the department where the incident took place, they also look at the report. And finally, every hospital has one risk manager who also look at all reports from all departments at the hospital. And finally, some selected reports are anonymized and sent to a national department of patient safety. There are several ways to handle these reports. Some are refused because of very, very minor injuries. Some are accepted, and if they are accepted, they are classified and scored in order to the severity, and they are analyzed, and there is coming a feedback to the department or to the healthcare person if he was not anonymized. It's voluntary when you fill in a report if you want to do it anonymized or if you want to give your name. But whatever happens, you can't be punished from doing a report. So in the old days we had the punishing system. In this system you had to find guilt, and the guilt was almost an individual responsibility. That meant that a lot of these incidents were hidden. They were never shown and never discovered. And there was a punishment. So there was no one who really wanted to show or report any incidents because they were punished. This meant there was no learning or prevention. And this is in contrary to the system we have now. It's an open and learning system, and it should be without fear. The motto of the new system is that today it was you, tomorrow it could be me. It's not the specific individual, it's more that the system, and the system must take errors into account and prevent these. The system knows that it's people working there and they may do some errors, so they have to organize things so that it's difficult to make errors. And patient safety is to minimize the risk of errors. Probably always will be errors, you can't avoid that. But it's not the individual, but the organization. I know it's a little unclear, this picture, but here we have an organization who buys medicine that looks quite similar. It buys 4 potent medicine that are different and to be used in emergency settings. So when a healthcare person mix up this medicine, in the old day you say, well, you are a fool, you mixed up, why didn't you read the etiquette? But the new approach is, why did the organization buy medicine that look totally alike? There must be some errors. It's in emergency settings, and the thing will be confused, and people are stressed. So the organization must buy medicine that doesn't look alike. That was just an example. Our patient compensation system is a little like Sweden, but with a few differences. It's also a no blame, we may call it a no fault compensation system. It's quite equal. And there's a law saying that a healthcare person, he is bound to inform a patient suffering from a serious complication that there's a possibility of compensation, and he has, if it's necessary, to help the patient filling in the claim. He cannot guarantee that there's going to be compensation. It's not the healthcare person who decides that. And to this system, there's no legal action at all. It's the same as with the adverse events reporting. They cannot be used to punish the healthcare person. When the patient fills in a claim, he sent the claim to the Patient Insurance Association. And the Patient Insurance Association is actually just one house. 150 people work there, 100 lawyers, there are 35 doctors part-timely working there, and 15 other employees. So all cases, they are evaluated by a lawyer and a medical specialist. Anesthesia cases are evaluated by an experienced specialist in anesthesiology, and so on. And the Sweden talk about avoidability. We have changed those rules in Denmark, and we have 4 criteria. One of them has to be fulfilled in order to get compensated. And you may say that Rule 1 corresponds to the avoidability rule in Sweden. Rule 1 say an experienced specialist would have acted differently, and thereby the injury would not have happened. So you may say an infection after a procedure that could happen to an experienced specialist as well. So that is not, you're not compensated for an infection after a procedure. That's just an example. Criteria 2 is if the injury was caused by failure of the technical equipment. So no one did anything wrong, but the technical equipment failed. That could be an infusion pump suddenly not working, giving the patient no medicine. Third, alternative treatments more safe and offer the same benefits. Well, if there are 2 treatments that are quite equal and one is used, then the patient could get compensated if the other treatment wouldn't have given the same injuries. And finally, the most used criteria, and it's saying it's a rare injury. And by rare, we use the term below 2%. And that's not enough. It has to be more than rare. It also has to be more extensive than the patient is expected to endure. A very severe disease has to endure a more severe complication. The patient with severe heart disease going for a major heart surgery, she cannot be compensated for, let's say, precision injuries. While the completely healthy person going for a minor surgery, if he is suffering from a precision injury, well, he gets compensated. So you have to take into account how sick is the patient. And the compensation is calculated almost like they do in Sweden. Pain and suffering, that means how many, often how much they stayed in the hospital. Reduced income, there's a limit. The richest person in Denmark earning 1 billion, well, he would not get 1 billion in compensation, of course. And then there is a reduced ability to work, medical expenses, and if it's a permanent injury. And by that you decide how disabled is the patient. Is he 100% disabled and he get quite a lot of money, or is he only 5% disabled? A permanent nerve injury often gives 5%. It's important that we, in this system, are not interested in very small injuries, in compensating to very small injuries. Therefore, there's a lower limit of $2,000. So tooth injuries that cost perhaps $200 to fix, they are not compensated. The amount is too small. This is the numbers of claims in the Danish Patient Insurance Association for the last 3 years. And as you can see, the numbers are rising. We don't think it's because more injuries happen, but we think that people are becoming more aware of the system. And as you can see, the Patient Insurance Association covers all aspects of the healthcare system in Denmark. It covers the public hospitals, the private hospitals, and everything else. In general, 36% of the claims are compensated. And in 2010, total compensation reaches $130 million. So to compare with Taiwan, you have to multiply by 5 or 6 to have the number here. There's a handling time of 220 days in average. Some cases takes very long time, some are very quickly done. We have approximately 2.4 million Danes that are treated annually at the public hospitals. And we have a goal that we want to reduce the number of injuries by 20% over the next 3 years. During the past 5 or 10 years, the spirit of patient safety has risen in Denmark and all over Europe. But it's quite interesting that it's a new phenomenon. One of the first conferences in patient safety was held in 2 years ago. So it's a new phenomenon in Europe as well. But how will we reduce the number of injuries by 20%? Well, we'll use the cases in our system where they were compensated after the criteria 1, an experienced specialist would not have made the injury. And by doing that, it's possible to discover some patterns in relation to, it could be inexpedient work procedures, outdated clinical instructions, or incorrect treatment regimes. Some hospitals, they are not up to date, and you can find these things by investigating the claims. This is still in the early stage, as I said. Also in Denmark, we have investigated birth injuries, and we found some important issues, and we have actually changed the guidelines and the procedures for these injuries, because there was a lot of death from these births that could be prevented, and we are looking for anesthesia injuries, position injuries, a lot of other claims. And finally, we know that the activity in our system is increasing very much. We have in our public hospitals seen a 19% increase in activity for the last 3 years. So we know that if we don't make any changes, then we will just have more injuries to these increasing number of treatments. So in Denmark we have now the spirit that we have to improve patient safety. So that's what I hope we can inspire you to do the same. Thank you very much.
This morning, two speakers talk about the 3 things. One thing, the patient safety is essential in quality in healthcare. The second two, to Earth is human. How to establish the no-blame system in Taiwan? As we know, that the Taiwan healthcare system also have the same problem. So how to solve the problem, we can learn their experience and share from in past year. They give up some the strategy. So because the time limit, we allowed 2 questions. One question from the Xiuchuan. Any question from the audience? Okay, Dr. Xie.
because the decision to compensation is decided by the availability. I just have maybe two practical cases to think about that is amniotic embolism got the cause delivering pregnant woman death. Would she get any compensation? And another kind disease is maybe medical hyperthermia. It seems not avoidable. So would it got any compensation? Just maybe these two kinds of diseases.
Yeah. Okay, embolism. If they forget to give prevention about if they forget to give prevention medicine for blood clot embolism, then the patient gets compensated. And if it's a quite healthy patient, she gets compensated by Rule 4. But if it's a very, very severe diseased patient where the cause probably is to the patient's own, let's say, cancer disease, she will not be compensated. What is it? Magnet hypothermia from anesthesia, yeah, they will definitely be compensated because it's a very rare disease. It's and it will. The patient should be severe diseased for not being compensated. We use Rule 4 and say that it's a rare incident below 2% as magnet and hypothermia is, and then it has to be compared with the patient's disease. So it's dependent on the disease, but it has to be very, very severe not to be compensated. It depends on the cases.
Thank you.
I think we also invite Dr. Gu Mingzhou give us to say something.
现在听得见吗？
可以。
郭院长，谢谢你们两位贵宾，我也很恭喜你们有叶光鹏叶医师、谢主任他们那么好的医师能够这么样有热忱，有忧国忧民的热忱。那么认真，那么有使命感我被他感动，感佩他们的那个努力的，所以参加了这一次邀请这个两位专家来给我们做这个国内做这个巡回演讲的这个活动我想这个叶医师脖子已经长了一个肿瘤了早就我们的神经外科已经叫他要开刀，他忍着痛，忍着病痛来办这个活动这个实在是非常令人感佩的一件事情。这一次能够联结上这个法学界联络上公卫学界能够来共同举办这个也是台湾有史以来第一次了我们为了社会各界也得到蛮多回响的，虽然法界可能还有一些质疑不过我想我们未来这个会再结合各方的这个力量来继续推动我想郭院长在国内做医疗品质这个也是一个领导这个怎么样子让我们的社会以后能够减少这个病人的伤害，能够预防这个伤害的发生我想这个我们秀传我也代表我们总裁，因为他今天在国外来代表我们的支持，希望大家一起来努力希望让医师也不要在刑法的伺候之下这个没有办法来好好的行医。我想这件事情今天这个礼拜这个起头，我想这是非常有意义的事情这个感激张基也给我们机会来参与，谢谢。
I think I have to close this meeting. Finally, I also thanks Mr. Espersson and Dr. Hove, and also thanks Dr. A. Guangpen. We organized the meeting. Thanks again. Thank you.